Get yourself one. It's good to be back. I heard you had another speaker while I was gone. You did okay, right? Yeah, we watched. We were watching from Montreal online. You know, realize how handy that online service is that you're not in town and you want to keep up with what is going on here in Choctaw. So props to the guys in the booth. We had a very clear, picture, and he's moving around a lot, so he was not very often out of the frame, so it's a good thing. All right, lesson number 4, Mark. Jesus, the Lord of all. We're going to cover chapter 4 to chapter 6. I do ask you to read ahead because I don't have time to read everything. As you know already, this class is a lecture style class. I've got more information than time. So of course, if you have a comment or a question that you want to ask, that's fine, But I am not going to solicit the questions. I'm going to just keep trying to give you the information as we go through. All right, so in our study so far, Jesus has begun to demonstrate his divine abilities and his person, and he does this through his teaching, the content and the style of his teaching, as well as the miracles that he performs. The reaction to him is very strong, but it's mixed. I would have thought, if you perform a couple of miracles, you got me, but apparently the reaction was mixed according to Mark's gospel. Everyone is amazed at both his deeds and his words, but some are skeptical and confrontational. And we find out that it's not the little people that are like that, but the leaders are like that because they're invested. They got skin in the game. And here's this new guy who all of a sudden teaches beyond their level of teaching and adds to that miracles. They can't compete with that. So instead of believing, they're believing the scriptures that they've studied all their lives. Instead, they confront and they suspect. And last time we looked at a series of 7 instances where Jesus was accused of all kinds of sins, even insanity, by the Jewish religious leaders as well as his family. That's what we did last time. And if you remember, his response to these always confirmed that what he did because of who he was and exactly according to God's word. His point was always, look to the word. You don't believe what I'm doing, you don't understand what I'm doing, go to the word. That's what you read, that's what you understand. I'm fulfilling the prophecies. After these confrontations, he continued to teach, but now he began to teach in what form? Anybody remember what I said? Yeah, in parable form. Some people say, why did he teach in parables? Because plain teaching was creating way too much havoc, way too much trouble and confrontation. It was slowing him down. He couldn't have any movement. So he begins teaching in parable in order to create less turmoil among the crowds. So in this way, the believers and the disciples continued to be taught, but the suspicious Jewish leaders are not around, are not able to follow what he's doing. And so the next section we'll do today will contrast what has just taken place. In the 7 previous encounters, there was skepticism and disbelief, even accusations. In this next section, Jesus encounters 4 situations and groups of people who witness his power and they believe. And for these people, Jesus is not only a great teacher and a miracle worker, he also becomes the Lord of hopeless situations, because all of the events I'm going to talk about this morning are really hopeless situations. And Jesus demonstrates that he can handle even hopeless situations. So when I say Lord of hopeless situations, I mean that in different ways, Mark will show Jesus' lordship over various areas of life that had complete power over ordinary people, but did not have power over him. Right? So we begin in chapter 4, beginning in verse 35, where Jesus demonstrates that he is the Lord of nature. So read along with me. On that day, when evening came, he said to them, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Hush, be still." And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they became very much afraid and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So after a series of teachings and miracle healings, Jesus sets to cross the Lake of Galilee, and he falls asleep on a cushion in the boat. He's tired from his work. He's a human being, remember? He's not, quote, Superman physically. Physically, he gets tired. He's got to eat. He has to sleep. So he's tired. And a storm, arises and threatens the boat, to sink the boat. Now, there must have been a fierce storm because these were all experienced fishermen. These were not newbies. They were used to being in the boat. They were used to being in storms. So it must have been quite a storm to frighten these experienced fishermen. They don't wake him up to ask him for help. They wake him up because he is sleeping through it, and they believe they're about to die. They've given up. This thing is taking us over. Wake up. So upon awakening, he calms the sea with only a word. He rebukes them for being afraid and having no faith. And their response was to be awestruck. We use the word awesome today. Wow, that was an awesome ice cream cone, but we're not using that word awesome. Awesome is what Jesus did. That was awesome. They were awestruck. They had no power over, here's the point. They had no power over the storm. They were at its mercy. And Jesus showed by this miracle that he had authority over the natural elements, because only God could control nature. Not predict it or explain it, but control it at will. That's why they said, "Who is this guy?" I mean, he controls the wind. We get he heals, because, there had been healers before. We get that part, as an apostle, yeah, he healed the sick guy. Okay, it's a miracle. But we've heard of those things before, people healing someone. The prophets did it. But to simply speak to the wind and the wind dies down, and to speak to the waves and the waves become calm, that they had never seen. And so he was the Lord over nature. So we continue in chapter 5, where Jesus demonstrates now that he is Lord over the spirit world. Read along. They came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. When he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And he had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains, and gnashing himself with stones. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him. And shouting with a loud voice, he said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torment me." For he had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And he was asking him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, "Send us into the swine so that we may enter them." Jesus gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. Their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and the country. And the people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed, sitting down, clothed, and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they became frightened. Those who had seen it described to them how it had happened, and to the demon-possessed man, and all about the swine. And they began to implore him to leave their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed, was imploring him that he might accompany him. And he did not let him, but he said to him, "Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he has mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. Wait, I need to go back here. Everyone was amazed. So immediately after calming the sea, they reach the other side. They're confronted by a man possessed by an unclean spirit. Now Jesus had done this before. He had cast out spirits before, but some were unimpressed, because these were demon possession cases that had been handled by the priests and the Pharisees as well at that time. The idea being that priests and Pharisees also cast out spirits, so Jesus did it as well, demonstrated that he could do it. So people were not necessarily very impressed with that. This time, however, Mark describes a man possessed by many demons, a legion of demons, who could not be cured by anyone or restrained by anyone. That's the point. They had tried with this guy. Nothing worked. They tried to chain him, restrain him, nothing to do. He lived among the tombs. If you were a Jew and you lived among the tombs, you were you were at the lowest ebb of society, because you were unclean many times over, because you were living among the dead. Okay. Again, Jesus cures him with simply a word, and the demons are cast out. Now, this particular healing has some interesting features. He has dialogue with the demons. You don't see that in other situations. He has dialogue with the demons, and probably to demonstrate to the man and his disciples that he knew the problem, but was without fear. In other words, yeah, these are demons and everybody's afraid of them, but I'm not afraid of them. I'm talking to them. I'm ordering them about. And so Jesus sends the demons into the nearby herd of swine. Why are there swine there? Because in this area there were many Gentiles who lived in this area, and so there was swine. They herded swine in that area. Now, some think that he sent the spirits into the swine in order to reassure the man that the demons were truly out of him and physically somewhere else. Just to say, okay, they're out, they're gone, don't worry about it, it's all good, No, Jesus sends them into the swine, so the man who had been possessed recognizes that they're not in him anymore, they're in the swine, and he has physical proof of his own healing. The destruction of the swine is sometimes questioned. Why would Jesus destroy all these pigs? And the answer is, a man's life is worth a lot of pigs. A man's life is worth a lot of pigs or sheep or cows or whatever. There's no comparison there. It's not an argument. So the people of the town are angry, they're frightened. They didn't ask for remuneration for the pigs. They just wanted Jesus to leave. They didn't understand what was going on. Again, they couldn't get past the destruction of the animals to see what had actually happened. So the man is completely sane, he's dressed, he's at peace after years of insanity and torment. And we know today people suffer from various psychological problems, and they get help. they see psychiatrists and they have medication, and with time, they get better. They manage their symptoms, as I like to say. How you doing? I'm managing my symptoms. Well, many people learn how to manage their symptoms. But this man was made well instantly. A lifetime of suffering from insanity is healed instantly. So that's why it's a miracle, okay? So Jesus leaves the man, and the man wants to come with him. But Jesus tells him to go to Decapolis, Deca, 10, polis, city, Decapolis, the 10-city region. So that's where he comes from. Go to the 10-city region and publish the news of your healing. Because the people in your hometown and in your region, they know that you're the crazy guy who lives in the cemetery, and all of a sudden you come back and you're sane and you're logical and you're able to articulate what has taken place to you. You witness, go and witness what has taken place. Later, Jesus will return to this area, and he'll do great miracles, and he'll have great success in his preaching there, largely due to the fact that the man went home to tell of his healing. They weren't ready to hear him right away, but after a while, after the witness of the demoniac, people were ready to listen. And when Jesus went back there several months later, he had great success. So Jesus, after demonstrating that he had power over the natural world, he says to the wind, settle down. He shows that he also has power over the spiritual world. Again, with just a word, he controls the evil spirits. He overcomes nature in the outside world, and he overcomes the demons in the inside world. He's the Lord of the outside of man, nature, and he's the Lord of the inside of man, the spirit world. And so the reader is left with the conclusion that only God has power over demons, and so Jesus must be God. It's mathematics. If only God can control nature and Jesus controls nature, therefore Jesus must be God. If only God has power over the spirits and Jesus has power over the spirits, well then Jesus must be God. That's the point. That's what Mark is doing. A third power. Jesus is Lord of illness. Mark chapter 5, 21 to 34. I'm not going to read that. I think the stories are familiar. Mark intertwines two stories here, each showing Jesus' concern and his power. At first, Jesus is confronted by a synagogue official. Today, it would be a minister. He'd be a minister, whose daughter is ill to the point of death. And he comes and he begs Jesus to come and to heal her. So Jesus agrees, but on the way, he's interrupted by a woman who secretly touches his cloak with the hope of being healed from her own disease. And we find out in the story here, the account rather, that we read, the crowd was pressing in, because wherever he went there was a crowd. They were pressing in on him, and she reached through the crowd to touch his cloak. Now we learn that she suffered from uterine bleeding, which didn't stop. We also learn that her condition had bankrupted her with doctors, and also did not permit her to attend services at the temple because she was considered unclean. The law said a woman, while she was on her cycle, was considered unclean and had to wait till her cycle was over, and then had to go through certain conditions to be rendered ceremonially clean again so that she could continue to go to the temple and to worship and so on and so forth. Well, this woman, with her continual bleeding, was never clean. She was never, she never was out of that state of not being ceremonially clean. So she couldn't worship. She couldn't go, she couldn't go to church, basically, because of her physical condition. And if you're in a religion where, if your life is bound together with your religion, if your religion is the center of your life, it's everything in your life, and you can't practice it fully, That's a very debilitating, spiritually debilitating condition. It's not just physically she's suffering, spiritually she's suffering as well. So the woman is immediately healed, but Jesus forces her to acknowledge her illness and what she had done, and of course the results. And we know the reason was to publicly declare the miracle and also to verify that she was now healed and she could return to worship in the temple. In other words, if she kept it secret, nobody knew. She was in the same social position. But by making it public and then, going to the priests and so on and so forth, she could, rejoin her former life. And so a disease that had been treated for years, that was not mental or spiritual in nature, she wasn't possessed by a demon, that was uniquely female in nature, Jesus heals, never mind without saying a word. I mean, she's healed just by touching his cloak. So Jesus is not only Lord over illness, but his lordship is expressed by his mere presence. Just the fact that he is present has healing power. And we find out that in the future, when he sends out the apostles, what happened with Peter? You see the connection? Anybody? I gave you a chance. Same thing with Peter, right? In the book of Acts, we find out even Peter was walking through the streets and people would lay down their sick and just, Peter would walk by and they were healed. Same power that Jesus gave to Peter. Then we learn about, so the Lord of illness. The fourth thing, Jesus is Lord of death. Lord of nature, Lord of spirits, Lord of illness, Lord of death. We read, it says, while he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official saying, your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore? But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, do not be afraid any longer, only believe. And he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw a commotion and people loudly weeping and wailing and entering in. He said to them, why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep. They began to laugh at him, but putting them all out, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered the room where the child was. Taking the child by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded. And he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this. And he said that something should be given her to eat. The people were awestruck again, and he had to remind them about just ordinary things. She might have been hungry. So Mark continues the narrative with the story of the synagogue leader's daughter. As we have read, a report comes that she has died, and the father gives up hope. He's ready to accept this fact. Jesus offers him hope, telling him to believe and not to be afraid. Amazing how many times Jesus has to say to people, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Isn't that one of our problems? We're afraid. We get to be afraid. We're afraid as we're growing up that we won't make it. I won't make it. I won't be able to do this. I won't be able to do that. And then when we make it and we have a home and a family and things are going, then we're afraid all over again for our children. Somebody will hurt our children won't do well, and so on and so forth. We're always afraid. And Jesus is always telling us, don't stop being afraid. Don't be afraid. So when he arrives, the professional mourners are there, as well as a crowd of people. And I know about professional mourners because when my dad died, we had professional mourners. He was Italian, and the Italians, especially of a certain generation, had professional mourners, and they had hired professional mourners to come. And these were women. There were 3 or 4 of them, all dressed in black, and they walked into the funeral parlor, and they walked in, and they immediately in walking in, they started crying, "Oh, Antonio," and they were crying, as they were walking up to the coffin, which was at the end of the room there, and when you have a viewing is what it's called. And he had three days of viewing, from 9 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, 3 days in a row. That's how, people in and out all the time. Anyways, so the professional mourners come, and they throw themselves down on their knees in front of the coffin, this and that. Then one of them looks inside and realizes, wrong guy. The guy they were mourning for was on the second floor in another room. So they stopped right away. Whoops, and they looked at each other and they composed themselves, and then they went upstairs, and then you heard, "Oh, Antonio," and then they started all over again. Sorry, it has nothing to do with this, but it brings back a memory. Anyways, the professional mourners are there, as well as a crowd of people who laugh, and as Jesus announces that she's not dead, she's only sleeping. He brings only those who believe. That's the point. The apostles and the parents with him. He might have brought the others, but they didn't believe. So he brings them with him to witness the miracle of bringing the child back from the dead. Again, Mark demonstrates Jesus' lordship over another impossible enemy of man, and that's death itself. We have no power over illness, no power over the spirits, no power over nature, no power over death. So these 4 episodes establish Jesus as one with divine power to overcome those things over which man has traditionally had little or no control: nature, the spirit world, illness, and death. We have some, I won't say control, but some effect. We can predict the weather, to a certain extent. We can mitigate illness to a certain extent. We can understand the spirit world to a certain extent. And death we have no power over at all. We only learn to accept it. That's about it. And so up until this time, Mark is describing isolated incidents of Jesus' preaching and miracles and the various reactions to it. With time, Jesus' ministry expanded, and Mark describes this evolution as well as more reactions to Jesus' increasing fame. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and Mark begins to describe that, how his fame and his influence grows. So again, first of all, the expansion of Jesus' ministry in his hometown. In chapter 6, 1-6, won't read that. The news and the fame of his teaching and miracles reach his hometown before he does. People talk about it, gets back to his hometown, he's still away. Their response is skepticism. How can someone from there, which is a nowhere place in the backwaters, be doing these great things? They even mentioned Jesus as the hometown carpenter's son and one of many in a local family. Wait a minute, is this the same Jesus? His 4 brothers and sisters? We think a family of 7, 4 brothers they mention. With Jesus, that's 5, and they say, and his sisters, plural. We don't know if it's 2 sisters or 5 sisters, but at least 2. This Jesus, the oldest of this family that's been with us for years, this is the Jesus? And Jesus this time is the one who is amazed at their unbelief. And he does very little ministry there. But he does continue to teach them in their synagogues. He was sent to preach the good news, and he does this, but without the accompanying miracles in his hometown. Why? Because they're predisposed not to believe him, So when you're predisposed not to believe, what's going to happen? Well, you're not going to believe. As the Hebrew writer said, those who come to God must first do what? Believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. What's the reward for diligently seeking him? What's the reward? You find him. Yes, you find him. You find him, you know him. That's the reward for diligently seeking him. And so the second expansion that he talks about is the sending out of the 12. So far, he's been the only one doing. The disciples, apostles, they're following. But now he's going to send out the 12, verses 7 to 13. Again, I'm not going to read it. Time is moving on, and he can only be in one place at a time. Remember, in Philippians, it says he emptied himself. What did he empty himself of? Well, his divine powers. God is, all-knowing, all-seeing. He's he can be in more than one place at a time. Omnipresence. He divested himself of his omnipresence. He could only be in one place at a time. If he was in Nazareth up in the north, it took him time to get from Nazareth down to Jerusalem. Like every other human being, he had to walk or ride, but he couldn't just poof, disappear from one place and be at another place. So now he sends out the apostles to replicate his ministry. He gives them the ability to do miracles. He gives them the charge to preach the gospel. He gives them instructions about their conduct and their ministry. In other words, he will provide for them, so don't bring extra. Don't bring an extra coat, extra food. I will take care of you. He tells them to live in one place that will, receive them. In other words, no begging from door to door, as was the custom of many, rabbis and teachers and so on and so forth. They'd go from door to door. And if they reject you, then just leave. An important phase of training for the future begins with this sending out of the 12. So there's the second expansion of his ministry. Another expansion is Jesus and Herod in verses 14 to 29. At this point, Jesus' fame reaches the top ruler of the area. And John gives us some background information about Herod. One of the few times that he does, not John, but Mark rather, one of the few times he does this in the gospel. Do you understand what I mean when I'm saying his ministry expands, his hometown, he sends out the 12, and now his ministry is expanded to the point where it's reached the ears of the king. It's like in this day and age, our ministry, will grow, and, the governor knows about the Choctaw Church of Christ and the kind of work that we do. Wow, our ministry is growing and other people are knowing about it. Well, here, Herod knows about it. Herod and his sons had gained power in this area through political collusion with Rome. The present Herod was the son of the Herod who had killed the children in Bethlehem during Jesus' infancy. This Herod right here, he had abandoned his own wife and had eloped with Herodias, who was already married at the time to his brother, while he was visiting in Rome. He was also her half-uncle by blood. I haven't been able to figure that out, but he was related to her as her uncle, half-uncle by blood. Anyways, his marriage to Herodias was a definite no-no. It broke a lot of rules. It broke the law in many different ways. And we know that John the Baptist denounced this union, and in so doing threatened Herodias' position as queen. Herod knew Jewish law and custom, and he understood John's preaching and what it meant. During a supper given in honor of his nobleman, Herod is tricked into promising Herod's daughter a special favor. What does she do? She comes out and she performs a dance, perhaps a very erotic dance, and Herod is infatuated with her, and in a moment of foolishness, he offers her anything up to half his kingdom. That was a saying, up to half of my kingdom. Didn't really mean he'd give her half the kingdom. It just meant, ask me for anything. You want a nice piece of jewelry, would you like a special position? I'll put you in charge of this or that. And so her mother uses the opportunity to tell her daughter, go tell the king you want the head of John the Baptist, on a plate. And of course, Herod is in a bad position. All of his noblemen are there. He doesn't want to be embarrassed, and so he follows through. He didn't want to kill John the Baptist. He was actually afraid of him. But he goes ahead and does this. So Mark uses this flashback device to introduce an important character of that era and also to describe the circumstances that brought to an end the ministry of John the Baptist, an important character introduced earlier in his book. Also a way of explaining the growth of Jesus' ministry, and that's my point. We're saying, I'm showing you examples, or rather Mark is showing examples of how Jesus' ministry grew. Well, it grew, it began in his hometown. He sends out the 12, and now with John's death, all of John's disciples move over and begin following Jesus. So there's another expansion of his ministry. All right, fourth example. How's the time? Okay, yes. Jesus and his disciples, Mark chapter 6, verse 30 to 56. So Matthew and John record long passages where Jesus is actually teaching his apostles. There is much dialogue and questions and answers between them in Matthew and John. Mark, however, doesn't give long passages of sermons and exhortations. He shows us Jesus teaching them by doing, by giving examples, by sending them out to do and to receive their response. And we have examples of this in this particular section of Mark. For example, there's the retreat, Jesus and his disciples. So we read about the retreat. Upon their return, he tries to, he sends out the 12. When they come back, he tries to bring them away to rest and refresh themselves after their first tour of ministry. And we do see, however, that they report everything that they did to him. Next is the rally, 33 to 44. What begins as a retreat with just Jesus and his apostle ends up as a rally, as thousands of people gather together to hear Jesus. So Jesus' miracles and teachings and the recent, bell number 1, I heard it, and the recent preaching tour of the apostles has stirred up the population to come and hear Jesus for themselves. He sends out the 12. They tell the people about Jesus. The people are excited to hear about Jesus, so they want to hear the man himself. So now that's how the big crowd is formed. That expands Jesus' reach as far as teaching is concerned. He is confined because of time and distance, and because now Herod is stalking him, so the crowds begin to come to him. Before, he went from town to town, right? He can't do that anymore because Herod is, trying to get him. So instead, he stays in one place, and the crowds come to him. So Jesus is giving his apostles an illustration of several important lessons here. First, humans have both the physical and spiritual needs that they must satisfy as ministers. You want to be a minister? Well, then you're going to have to minister physically to the physical needs of people as well as their spiritual needs. Because people sometimes are hungry for food, and you have to help them find that food. And sometimes people are hungry spiritually, and you have to help them find Jesus to satisfy that spiritual hunger. Secondly, he demonstrates that Jesus can fulfill both needs, since with him there is always more than enough. Without him, in this story here of the rally, without him there were only 5 loaves and 2 fish. But with him there was more than enough to take care of the hunger of the people. They've just ministered. They've done miracles. He reminds them that he is the source of these things, not they themselves. Just in case they were getting a big head, that they went out and they ministered and they did miracles, he demonstrates where they get this power from. And then the walking on the water in verses 45 to 52 demonstrates that they were slow learners. He sends them across the lake by themselves after the rally. They were having problems with the storm, and the boat had not, the boat was having problems, but they had not called on him yet. They didn't say, Jesus, help us. When they see him walking on the water, what's their reaction? What is it? One word. Huh? Fear, yes. They're afraid again. They're always afraid, right? So here they have witnessed miracles. They themselves have performed miracles. They've seen him exercise power over every natural and spiritual element. They have heard his teaching, but they still didn't understand the conclusion that this was pointing to. Not that he was a man who did miracles, but that he was the divine Son of God. They never could kind of make that last step. How do we know that? Because they were always afraid when something happened. And then more miracles, the last section. When they reached the other side of the lake, Mark describes almost in an offhand manner the many more miracles Jesus continued to do, even without speaking. Just his presence now producing great healings. The apostles again witnessing his great display of power and slowly coming around to the idea of who Jesus really was. All right, let's finish. So this will mark the beginning of the final time Jesus will perform public miracles. In the next 2 chapters, there will be more confrontation and several other key miracles, but from here on in, he's going to begin to prepare his disciples for 2 great truths. First of all, his true identity, that he is the Son of God and that he is the Messiah. He's going to start, focusing in on this idea. And secondly, his true mission, which is to die on the cross. He's going to start getting them ready for that. Those who claim to be faith healers today, for example, they forget the original purpose of miracles. The original purpose of miracles was to witness to the divinity of Jesus and also to witness to the truth of his word. This is why Jesus and only the early disciples did the miracles. We don't have them today. Why? Well, we don't need miracles. We have God's word as a witness of Jesus' divinity. All right. So next time, I ask if you want to, be familiar as I go through this material. I ask you to read chapter 7 and 8 from Mark, and we will cover that next week. I hear that second bell. Thank you very much for your attention and your questions and comments. Appreciate it. À la semaine prochaine.